welcome everyone. For those of you who are online who may not know me, my name is Julie Carestis, and I am the American University and Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies postdoctoral fellow. I'm very pleased to introduce today's guest speaker as part of AU's Jewish Studies program series, Acts of Remembrance, Shaping Holocaust Memory in the 21st Century. Géraldine Schwarz is an author, journalist, and documentary filmmaker. Her much-acclaimed first book, Those Who Forget, My Family's Story in Nazi Europe, a memoir, a history, a warning, explores Europe's post-war reckoning with fascism by examining the lives of her German and French grandparents in Nazi Germany and Vichy France. The book has been translated into over 12 languages and has won numerous prizes, including the European Book Prize, Germany's Winfried Peace Prize, and Italy's North-South International Prize for Literature and Science. She will begin by speaking a bit about the family history that informs her book, and will then be joined in conversation by distinguished professor of history Michael Brenner, with time for a Q&A session to follow. And to the members of the online audience, please know that closed captioning is enabled for this session, and you will be able to also ask questions by typing them in the chat. Please, let's give a very warm welcome to Géraldine Schwarz.
Thank you. So I'll just ask the first question, but first of all, I want to really thank Julie Carestis for organizing it together, of course, with my colleague Pamela Nidell, who organizes this whole series. And I think we brought a really very acclaimed speaker here. I just saw some of the reviews. I think Samantha Power reviewed the book in the New York Times, and there was New Yorker and other amazing reviews it got in America. I remember some of those reviews in Germany. And of course, there are reasons for it. And I think we'll all try to understand why this book received the attention it did. So let me ask the first question. What made you actually write that book? It's a mixture of a biography, of a biographical story, and really a history of mainly post-war Germany.
Hello everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad and I feel very honored to be able to speak about my book here at the American University. Actually, the motivation for writing the book was more political than personal. I was very concerned, and I'm still very concerned, about the rising populism and far-right parties in Europe. And I thought, are we about to forget? Are we about to forget about what we thought we had learned about the fascist past of Europe? And so I thought, why not trying to write a kind of contribution to memory work, a contribution which would maybe help the reader to understand that we can actually learn from history. So it is, in a sense, a positive book. First, I thought maybe my family history is not that relevant, that important. But then, for me, it was quite obvious that if I write a book about memory work, I have to do my own memory work in my own family. Otherwise, I wouldn't be credible. I knew that my grandfather was a member of the Nazi Party. I also knew that he wasn't a convinced Nazi. He was more a Nazi out of opportunism. He didn't have any important official position in the Third Reich. He wasn't a soldier in the army. So he was what I called him a Mitläufer, somebody who follows the current, mitlaufen. But by doing more researches for the book, I discovered that my grandfather actually went a bit more further than just following the current. I discovered in the cellar of our family building in Mannheim, which is a city in southwest Germany, a contract that stipulates that my grandfather bought company from a Jewish family in 1938. Therefore, he profited from the anti-Semitic Nazi policies. And this was for me maybe a motivation to go even further in this figure of my grandfather being a Mitläufer, because I thought maybe this very quite banal story, it is actually quite a banal story for Germans in the Third Reich to having taken advantage from Nazi anti-Semitic policy. But precisely because he has a banal story, maybe it is even more relevant, because the reader can identify with him, because his story is actually the story of many Germans of the Third Reich at that time. Most of them were not persecutors, they were not victims nor heroes. Most of them were Mitläufer. In the collective memory of war and dictatorship in Europe, we often tend to divide society, the attitude of society, in three categories: perpetrator, victims, or heroes. And by doing this, we forget a bit about this mass of Mitläufer. However, this is one major actor which allowed the Third Reich to consolidate. And so maybe by writing a book about my grandfather, I actually write a book about Mitläufertum, about how as an individual you can become accomplice of a criminal regime just out of opportunism or indifference.
Let's stay a little bit with the family story before we go to the more general picture. How did your family, like your parents or your aunt whom you describe, and of course your mother is French, your father is German, how did your family, maybe especially in the German side, react when you wrote this history? Because you don't have really memories of your grandfather, right? He died too young.
Yes, well, I didn't have this loyalty problem because my grandfather died before I was born. My grandmother died when I was 6. And so it's of course easier to write a book about people who are dead. But there is also, I felt that I have a responsibility because they're not here anymore to defend themselves. I tried to be as fair as I could, so to contextualize and not to judge with our today's moral standards. And to know my grandfather better, I had 2 witnesses, my father and his sister, my aunt. And my father tended to be very severe with his own father, whether my aunt would tend to justify the deeds of her father and to excuse him, saying, we can't understand this time, we can't judge a time we haven't lived through, it was impossible to resist without risking your life. My aunt was a bit, I think felt a bit offended because of the book. She felt that I'm giving a very negative image of her father, and it took a bit of time before she finally accepted the idea that it is this private story has maybe the power to help young generations to understand a bit better why history can help them today shape the present. And so this was the reaction in my family on the German side. And on the French side, the story is a bit different, but there also I have a grandfather who was a Mitläufer. I don't know if you're familiar with the history of occupied France under the Second World War. In June 1940, France was defeated after 6 weeks and divided in 2 zones. The northern zone was occupied by the German army, and the southern zone was the so-called free zone under the government of an authoritative regime headed by Maréchal Pétain. And my grandfather on the French side was a policeman serving this regime called the Vichy regime. And he was serving in a little town on the border between the free zone and the occupied zone. So his mission was actually to arrest illegal refugees from the north, and most of them were resistance or Jews. So on this side too, I have grandfather who was a Mitläufer, but I'm less strict with my French grandfather because he was very poor and he had to feed his family, and he was a gendarme, a policeman, also before the Vichy regime took place. So his collaboration with a criminal state is not as bad as the one on the side of my German grandfather, who really took an initiative by buying this Jewish company.
Yeah, I think it is actually very important to look at people who we call Mitläufer, those who stood by, who looked at the things without taking or without being active Nazis or without being in the resistance. So in the middle, if I may, just bring in a bit of my own family story. My mother, who grew up Jewish in Dresden, and she was younger, but she was in high school in the 1930s. She always said that she found it especially hard, those people who looked the other side. She said, I didn't expect anything better from those who were really convinced Nazis. And I know there were a few who wanted to help us, but 90% when they saw me, especially when she had to wear the yellow star on the street, they just went on the other side of the street as if they never, like my classmates, as if they had never seen me, never known me before. And that hurt most, I think. But you also got in touch with the family, the Jewish family who your grandfather bought for, of course, not the real price, the business from in 1938. Do you want to tell us a little bit how that encounter was?
Yeah, my first reaction when I found this contract was actually to search for this family, search for traces. And finally I found one witness, a cousin of this family, Loepman, who lived in a London suburb. Lotte Kramer is her name. She was 95 and I had the chance to meet her. And so she told me about the terrible fate of the Loepmans. The Loepmans sold their company because they were forced to do so, but also because they had to finance their exile. They wanted to go to Chicago. But apparently they didn't manage to get a visa for the United States. And 1 year later, they got trapped, they got deported by the Nazis to south of France, where the authorities were collaborating with the Third Reich. And most of them were deported to Auschwitz and died in Auschwitz. But one of them managed to escape the camp. His name is Julius Loepman, and he went to Chicago. And after the war, he demanded reparations to my grandfather. I found letters in this cellar in Mannheim in exchange between my grandfather and this survivor, Julius Loepman, and the lawyers of Julius Loepman, where my grandfather is in total denial of his responsibility and refuses to pay. And at the beginning, he has, of course, a lack of empathy, and he compares his own fate with the one of Julius Löbmann, because, of course, the situation in Germany after the war was also terrible for the Germans, was quite dreadful. But he has this total lack of empathy, and his letter is marked by heartlessness. And with time, it gets even worse because Julius Löbmann doesn't give in, and my grandfather gets more and more aggressive. And he reverses the roles, presenting himself as a victim of the profiteer, the Jewish profiteer, Julius Löbmann. And I asked myself if this is symptomatic of Germany's society in the 50s, and it was. But finally, my grandfather had to pay the requested amount to Julius Löbmann.
Yeah, I think it's very typical. I mean, also
Yes.
from my own research in the post-war period, you have a lot of letters from Germans who write to some former acquaintances who were Jewish and were emigrated is such a it's not such a correct term. They were really driven out, right? They were expelled. They were refugees, and then some of those letters say, "Oh, you have it so good in America. You have it so good in England. You don't have to suffer this hunger now we have in post-war Germany." And suddenly, this self, right? This role as victim. You describe this very well, and for a historian, you have this amazing treasure, these letters which you quote extensively, because I think most families they're so ashamed they throw this away, or they wouldn't give it even to archives. But you found them actually in the house? Or?
Yes, in folders in the cellar of the family building, which is still ours. And my grandfather kept the letter. I mean, this was also quite common at that time. You know, you would type the letters with a carbon paper. So so I found the carbon papers.
Yeah.
So all his letters, which Julius Löbmann only wrote once, very shortly, briefly, and most of the time it's his lawyers who wrote to my grandfather.
And do you think, from what you heard, did he, and then we can also think about German society in a whole, how much did he ever reflect that maybe there was something wrong he had done, and how much was, well,
I think one very powerful trick of the Third Reich was to make crime legal. And so my grandfather actually knew that he had acted legally. I mean, all was legal. There was a contract which was authorized by the Nazi authorities under the Third Reich. And so I think that maybe he had difficulties to understand that the Third Reich, being a criminal state, everything which was legal under the Third Reich was actually illegitimate. This was to understand that he was part of something bigger, something criminal. I think this never occurred to him. But I am quite sure that when he bought the company for a low price, that he was aware that he was taking advantage of the despair of the Jews. You know, the Germans, you know, I mean, the Third Reich was actually quite a regime which was not very long. It only lasted 12 years. And when my grandfather bought the company in 1938, it had only been the regime had only been in place for 5 years, and before that there was a democracy. So I cannot imagine that the German people in 5 years forget about the teachings they had before. So I think most of them actually knew that they were taking advantage of a situation.
If we go to the more general picture of German society, especially in the 1950s, how would you already indicated you thought that was rather typical of the way many dealt with this. Maybe you can say a little bit more about how this post-war German society dealt with their past.
Well, I think maybe it's important to add that most of societies in Europe after World War II wanted to forget about the past. There was no idea of learning from history. It's a new concept, that you can learn from history. At that time, the idea was more to use the past to glorify nations or to stir up revanchism. But after World War II, the trauma was so deep that most societies thought that the best way to rebuild the country was to forget about the divisions of the past and the traumas of the past. So that was, of course, the case in Germany, but also in France, in Italy, in the Netherlands. And so in Germany, it's called the Schlussstrich-Mentalität, to draw a bottom line, in order to build the country again on a new basis. Of course, this meant a terrible impunity. So in the 50s, in the end of the 50s, there were hardly any Nazis anymore in prison in Germany. And the parliament, when in 1949 the Federal Republic of Germany was created again, was created in 1949, the parliament passed each year really outrageous amnesty laws, and these were also supported by Social Democrats, which had been persecuted by the Nazis, because at that time the thought was prevalent that it is not possible to have a unified society if Germany is looking towards the past. And I don't know if you've read Hannah Arendt's book. She traveled to Germany in 1949-50, and she was totally shocked by this society marked by really a lack of empathy towards the victims of Nazism. One of the reasons was that most of them felt as victims themselves. My grandfather, in his letter, presented himself as a victim because Germany was heavily bombed, and after the war it was divided and occupied and quite poor. And so it is this very weird inversion of roles where most of German people in the 50s felt like victims. And this was also reinforced by Konrad Adenauer, the chancellor of that time, who had a difficult position because on one side he tried to integrate Western Germany in the Western world again. So he had to apologize officially for the crimes of the German state. But on the other side, he knew that his society was not ready for that. And so he publicly absolved the German people for the crimes committed by the state. So this myth that the crimes had only been committed by Hitler and a little group of criminals around him, was very, very deeply anchored for at least 20 years in German society.
Yeah, I mean, there was this idea that there were the Nazis, this small group, and then there were the Germans who were somehow not Nazis. There's this joke, which I'm thinking of while you're telling it, when a Jew who had left Germany, had to leave, who came back and he arrives, I don't know, in 1948 in Frankfurt at the train station, and he needs to go to the bathroom and looks for somebody who is watching his suitcases. And he looks around and he asks the first person, comes by, were you a member of the Nazi party? And he says, no, I was in the resistance. He said, thank you. Next person, were you a member of the Nazi party? No, I hid Jews in my basement. Thank you. The third person, were you a member of the Nazi party? Yes, I was a Nazi. Oh, you're an honest person. Can you watch my bags? So that was, nobody was a Nazi anymore at the time.
Yeah.
And then, of course, things also changed, though. I mean, later, and you mentioned it also towards the end of the book, and I remember it actually very well. I was in high school in 1979 when this American TV series, Holocaust, and everybody started talking about the Holocaust. I mean, even the term, of course, was not there before. But it started earlier in a way, and I think, actually in a way, if I may, since it's in the book, you can talk about it, the history of your father is interesting, because he felt, I think, an early distance to that past.
Yes, my father started to confront his own father in the late 50s. He was born in 1943, so he was still a teenager. And he quarreled a lot with his father. And I knew that before writing the book, and I always thought this is totally normal. But by writing the book and making this research, I discovered that in the 50s, most of society was never mentioning the past, and the medias were hardly mentioning the past. At school, the history lessons were, I think, maybe going until the First World War and the 20s, but then stopping before the episode of the Third Reich. So I asked him how come that he got so much interested in that past. He also read almost forbidden books about the Nazis. And he said that he had a teacher, so this is how important teachers can be. He had a teacher at school who had been a soldier on the Eastern Front, and he had guarded Soviet prisoners, that more than 3 million Soviet soldiers died in German camps. Many of them were executed by soldiers, and he said that actually he had the option to say no, to refuse to execute Soviet soldiers. That it was possible, if you didn't feel like it, not to execute these Soviet soldiers, and this has also been demonstrated by historians, that most of the soldiers who refused to take part to these kind of executions were not sanctioned after. Maybe they didn't have a great career, but they were not sanctioned after, and this made my father understand that the narrative which was predominant at that time was maybe not the truth. And the narrative was, as you said before, we had no choice. We had no choice, we had to obey. If you didn't obey the orders, you were killed. That was the narrative in the 50s. And so this is how he started to get really interested in that past. And he's part of this generation born during the war or after the war, who started to confront their own parents and to confront also the state, and ask that light be shed on this past. And it's the generation who really contributed to pull the German society out of amnesia. And I'm very grateful and that this generation made had the courage of this rupture, because here again for a long time I thought it's totally normal, I would have done the same, but by writing the book I thought to myself, would I have written this book if it would have been about my father being a Nazi and not my grandfather, and it would have been much more difficult for me. So I think this rupture was very painful.
Yeah.
It was probably very painful for these young people to acknowledge that their own parents were part of this terrific crime.
Yeah, I mean, it's in a way, it is. I mean, I'm saying this as a son of parents who both survived the Holocaust. You know, it sounds terrible, but it's in a way easier, right? It's in a way easier for me to cope with their past, even though their story was much more difficult. But I didn't suffer, at least directly, right? But it's these. But once you realize that your parents or grandparents were perpetrators or bystanders, or even like, you know, there were also some people who wrote about. I remember Niklas Frank, who wrote about his father, who was a terrible Nazi. He was like the governor of Poland for the Nazi Party. But he wrote about his father and how, you know, he copes with this every day because he was born. You know, he was not guilty.
I think he carries a picture of his dead father with him to be sure that his father is dead. You know?
Yeah, I mean, he
quite
wrote the
extreme.
story in the 1980s.
Yes.
It was a big, but it's, and I remember growing up in Germany, how in the 1970s and 80s, it tears apart families, of course, because some, in his case too, he was like the one child who really coped with what his father didn't defend his father. And I think in your case, a little different, of course, and your grandfather was, you know, obviously more of a bystander, but you think your aunt had a different role than your father, and so people look at it differently, and I think, you know, in 1945 the war is over, but it's not over. Families cope with their histories. I mean, imagine if you find out that your grandparents committed some crimes which nobody talked about, and they weren't also, you know, so it's a whole story. It's also a story of, I remember my mother always said about the families who you know, who were Nazis and who really profited a lot from Aryanizing. So yes, and nobody, and you know, they had to give back something, but they continued their whole careers after the war, and they were not forced to give back their business. The Neckermanns, you know, Neckermann was a big, and they actually were very nice. So I don't know. There is an initiative also to give back. I think. Do you know this? It's a private initiative where people find, but it's a story that doesn't end at 45, right? And it doesn't end even in the next generation, as we see in your book. And were you surprised about the reception of your book?
I was a bit surprised because as I said before, for me it is quite a banal story, because most of the Germans have these kind of stories in their families, you know. I was surprised that the book got attention also outside Germany, you know, and in many countries outside Germany. And I think it's because this figure of Mitläufer is not only German, and it's not only a figure of the Third Reich, but it is, of course, a universal and timeless figure, and that it sends us back to our own contradictions and our own responsibilities today, because we cannot imagine committing, crimes like Frank, the governor of Poland, or Dr. Mengele at Auschwitz. But we can imagine failing as my grandfather did, being tempted to take advantage of some policy to make money, I mean, unfortunately, I think today, I'm not sure it would be very different if these kind of policies would be passed today. If you have the opportunity to buy a beautiful flat for half of the price, I don't know if many would resist. So this is why I guess maybe the book had this kind of attention, because it reminds us that today we have to be very vigilant, not only towards others and towards, political leaders who uses similar methods of manipulation than 100 years ago, but also, or maybe almost, being vigilant towards ourselves, and to remind us of this, of our fallibility, our fallibility, and of how easy it is to become a bystander out of indifference or opportunism or conformism. I mean, there is also my grandmother, who I mentioned in the book, was also a Mitläufer, but from a different kind. She's more a Mitläufer out of blindness and indifference, a mixture of both. And she admired Hitler. She really admired him, like many in the 30s in Germany. The National Socialism made the Germans dream. It was not only, the Nazis not only convinced the Germans out of terror, with terror, but people were very seduced, also like the fascism in Italy. And this is perhaps another kind of Mitläufer, which gives us also some keys of how to react today to political parties who are very good at flattering our egos, at making us feel very special, more special than others. How well it works, it worked in the past and it still will work today. But what worries me is that my grandparents, at least, they didn't have political education. And it was this kind of manipulation of masses was new at that time. But today it's not, we should have learned from it. And I'm very worried that, the same kind of methods which worked 100 years ago are still working today.
Yeah, unfortunately, and you're so right. I mean, we all have to ask ourselves. It's easy to say, oh, these people were terrible back then. We do in a similar situation, and people were really, it was a deep economic crisis. People were suffering, and for many people, it meant to profit in some way, but it also meant to survive in some way, maybe. But let's open it up. We have about half an hour left, so I hope we'll get some questions from the classroom. Can we also get questions from? Yeah, okay, but we'll start. Professor Nadel.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you. It was fascinating. What made you go looking for the documents in the basement? How'd you find them?
Well, I wanted to make a contribution to memory work, and so I thought, let's start with my family. And I knew as a child, I knew that there was these yellow papers in the basement, and so I thought, let's just go and look at them. And it's weird because it took me a long time before looking at them, but most of us forget that we have witnesses of the past around us, our parents, our grandparents, our families, And we tend to read books and to look documentary films, and we forget to ask actually these witnesses who are around us. Even interviewing my father. I hadn't interviewed him before about his past and the past of his parents.
Did your father or other members of the family know what was in those documents? I mean, they sat there for decades.
I don't know if he knew that there were these documents, but he knew about the case, of course. He knew about the case. He was a boy at that time, but when he was a teenager, he would mention the Leupman case, and his father would then get totally crazy and be very annoyed by that. My father didn't really wanted to judge his parents because he himself didn't know what he would have done in the 30s. But what really annoyed him was that his father, even after the war, would not recognize his own deeds, his own responsibility, and not really consider that the Third Reich was a criminal regime. The memory work in Germany was not for the generation of my grandmother and grandfather. It was for the generation of my parents. My grandparents never acknowledged any responsibility.
Around. Professor Carestas.
Thank you so much. I'd like to talk a little bit more about your German grandmother and why she believed that the Nazis allowed her to dream. And you mentioned in your book her involvement with the Strength Through Joy organization, which is something that we've been talking about in class together. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yes. So the Nazis created an organization, Kraft durch Freude, Strength Through Joy, which offered many entertainments to the Germans at a low price, gymnastic, music lessons, dance, and they also offered vacations for a low price. And my grandmother had the chance to take a cruise for Norway on a brand new ship with modern cabins, with restaurants on board, with swimming pool, and that was incredible for a woman of her social condition at that time. And she, after the war, she kept, dreaming of this cruise she had taken. Yes, it's a regime. The Third Reich managed to be at the same time glamorous and also a bit socialist. I mean, it's National Socialism. They managed to give the feeling to the people, the feeling of equality to the people, even if actually it wasn't true. There was this idea of a Volksgemeinschaft, that we are part of a whole, and everybody is treated equally in this whole.
Right.
There's an online question. Dr. Brenner, my father fled Vienna and my mother fled northern Germany. How could your parents live and raise a child in post-war Germany? I don't know if the person's referring to them or you. They visited their homes but never considered living in their homelands. I think that must be their family.
Right. I mean, my parents can't answer this question anymore, but of course that was always an elephant in the room for the whole Jewish community in post-war Germany, which is very small. When I grew up there, I was born in the 60s, there were like 30,000 Jews in all of Germany. Everybody had their own reasons. My father was actually from Poland. He had survived concentration camps. For him, it was much, even more the question: how did he stay? His two sisters who survived went to America, and one of them never came to visit to Germany. So it's a similar story. But at the same time, my mother also encountered Germans who helped her to survive. And although she knew it was a very small minority, but there were those who gave them, like, you know, ration cards for food, which were actually forbidden for the better food, and risking their lives often, or the baker giving them things which were, so there were these, I mean, I think, you know, people understand, not everybody was the same, and there was a whole authoritarian regime. Still, after 1945, it was definitely a stigma for Jews living in Germany. And even the World Jewish Congress in 1948, I believe, issued a resolution saying that Jews should never build a community on the blood-stained soil of Germany and so on. They managed to live there. I don't really have the answer why they stayed, but they stayed, and they were always suspicious about people their age, and actually many of their friends later, when I grew up, were younger, so I was sure they weren't active Nazis. Or they were Jewish friends, but that was always, there was always a weirdness about it, but they stayed. I think my father simply, after what he went through, didn't have the power, the strength to start another life somewhere else. He ended up in Germany, as many Holocaust survivors after 45, because they went to the American zone, because they, first of all, they fled Poland because there was still very active anti-Semitism in Poland. So they went to the American zone, and then they all wanted to go on to, there was no Israel yet, but once there would be Israel or to America. But after that happened, he already had established himself with a little store, and I think they didn't have this strength to start somewhere else. Also didn't have the language. So everybody had their own reasons. And I think it's interesting that today there is a very much growing Jewish community in Germany, not 30,000 but 200,000, and most of them are from the former Soviet Union actually, and Israelis also.
Yes.
Kind of
Young
today in Berlin,
Israelis,
right?
many young
You
Israelis.
live in Berlin, there are
Yes.
20,000 or something Israelis.
Yes.
And there will be more, I'm afraid, seeing what's happening in Israel now.
Mm.
So I think we have to judge people according to, you know, what every individual does, and I try, even if it's hard as a historian also in post-war. I didn't live in post-war Germany, immediate post-war Germany, but you should judge people according to what they did and not to which collective they belong to.
But I think it's an interesting question because there is an anecdote I'd like to share. While writing the book, I was looking for witnesses who had known Julius Löbmann, the survivor, who had sold the company for a low price to my grandfather. And I got contact with someone called Ruth, and she accepted to talk to me on the phone. When I called her and I asked her several questions, she would really, I mean, I could feel that she didn't want to answer me, that actually she didn't want to talk to me. So after 10 minutes, I asked her, Ruth, so what's going on? I mean, I thought you agreed to talk to me. And she said, I hate Germany. And I thought, oh, I haven't heard that for such a long time. I was a bit shocked. I almost wanted to say, oh, but I'm not German, I'm French. And after that, I talked to some Jewish friends who know the United States quite well, and they told me that maybe the Jewish communities in the United States have still a very hostile image from Germany, more than the Jewish communities in Europe. Because when I go into presentations in Europe, you know, very often it's in structures with a Jewish background, and most of the time the responses, I mean the reactions to Germany are actually quite positive, because Germany did this memory work, because when you go to Berlin you see the traces of this work everywhere, you have the memorial in the middle of the city. So for example, in France, many Jews feel that their suffering is recognized, has been recognized by Germany. And maybe in the United States, because many of the Jews who live here fled Europe in the 30s, they kept this image of Germany without seeing, the changes in Germany.
And I think a lot of people grew up also with films and movies and popular culture where Germans are usually Nazis. But I'm thinking of another document in your book, which has nothing to do with Jews really, but French and Germans. It's that aunt of your mother. When she marries, when your mother tells her she's marrying a German. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, so my mother is French, and she married my father at the beginning of the 70s. And by doing so, she actually got half of her family was hostile to this marriage. And I found a letter that her aunt wrote, where she insults her deeply, saying, "How come that you marry a Bosch?" I mean, she uses terms that I can't translate in German, but very very insulting terms towards the German, and saying that she'd rather have my mother marry a beggar, a French beggar, than a German rich German man. Or so it's also this part of history that I had forgotten, how much Germanophobia there was in France for a long time. Even when I was a child in the 80s, I remember having a bit suffered from this Germanophobia.
I actually remember from my non-Jewish classmates when I grew up in Germany, it was still in the 70s, it was still, or 80s even maybe, sometimes uncomfortable for them to travel to France or Holland. Was also where, then Germans had done terrible crimes, and they don't always, and these were all kids who grew up in long after the war, but they felt they were not treated very, very nicely because they were from Germany. Maybe it still happens, but I think it was much more at the time then. Today, I think it's
changed,
quite
but there is, but this culture of guilt in which my father, for example, or even a bit myself, were brought up. I think now it's changing because the young generation, of course, I mean, you can't blame them anymore for these crimes, and also it's a bit counterproductive. If you want younger generations in Europe, in Germany, to be interested in that now distant past, we have to change the perspective on the way we are dealing with this past in Germany. If we do it in a culture of guilt, then we might discourage young generation to get interested in that past.
Can I add a point to contextualize the America experience that you were talking about? Because American Jews, starting with the rise of the Nazis, but certainly after the war, there was an unofficial, never organized by any organization, an unofficial boycott against buying German cars. And it lasted well into the 90s, the early 2000s, and I don't know if the students in the class know this, but I would have students at this university who would tell me that into the early 2000s, they would never buy a German car.
And it's really interesting because it's very different from Israel.
Yeah,
that
of
was
course.
never so much the case, but in the,
Well, but in Israel, they were driving Mercedes
it was
because
also part of the
reparations.
yeah. Well, they weren't driving Mercedes, but
Well, the taxi
the
drivers
little,
were.
the taxi drivers were,
the taxi
right,
drivers in the
right.
70s
They
were driving Mercedes.
Yeah,
But
others couldn't afford it, right?
Also, and also I didn't realize that many Jews who fled to the US then changed their names. They Americanized their names. In some families, they stopped speaking German, even if it was actually their first language. So.
Let's hear from Student Ben.
Yeah, so I know you mentioned that your French grandfather was a gendarme. Excuse me, so I was wondering, could you speak a little more to kind of how your family on the French side dealt with that legacy and, you know, sort of the impact of Vichy syndrome?
Well, you see, in this book, I wanted to write a book about the memory work in France and in Germany, but I ended up only writing 2 chapters about the memory work in France and 10 chapters about the memory work in Germany, because the memory work in France was not as developed as in Germany. And my mother, mother's attitude is symptomatic of this maybe lack of memory work in France, because she didn't know much about her own father when I asked her. I mean, she knew that he had been a gendarme, but I found it a bit intriguing that she hadn't asked anything to her father, knowing that he had been a gendarme under the Vichy regime. Most of the French in the 50s and the 60s were not really interested in the Vichy past. There was the memory was shaped by 2 myths in France after World War II. The first myth was that most of the population had resisted, and the second myth was that the authorities didn't have a choice. They had to collaborate. And in the 70s, American historian named Robert Paxton published a book, a shocking book for the French, demonstrating that only 2 to 4% of the population had actually really actively resisted to the Nazis, and that the collaboration was an initiative from the French state, who believed that Hitler would win the war and wanted to secure a place under the sun for France. And so it is not very surprising that on the French side of my family, I don't have very much information. But the reason why, of course, the memory work in Germany has gone so far is because of the trauma. I mean, you cannot compare the crimes of the Germans with the crimes of Vichy France. But I wrote the book to show that the way Germans dealt with this past could inspire other countries, because I think it is because the Mitläufer was at the center of the memory work in Germany, that Germany could actually build its democracy on a solid base. Through memory work, Germany managed to educate the people politically, And many countries in Europe have hidden behind the crimes of the Nazis to avoid to do their own memory work, especially Italy. But it's a miscalculation, because in the end, Germany benefited from this work to build this strong democracy.
More questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, I know you mentioned that you communicated with the family that your grandfather sold I guess he bought the business from. Have they ever given you a response about the book after you released it?
Well, Lotte Kramer, the cousin of this family, I met in London. She was 1905 when I met her, and I sent her the book, but I think she's dead now. So I'm not even sure that it was a couple of years later, when it was published in English, that I could send her the book. She didn't want to read it in German, by the way, and so I'm not sure that she was fit enough to read the book. But her daughter, Miriam, who gave me her contact in the first hand, she read the book, and she was very happy that she could have some insight. But she said her own children are not interested at all in the family story.
Can you elaborate on how they reacted to you when you reached out to them? Like about interviewing for this project? I mean, were they open to it or hesitant?
Miriam was not even aware that they had been in a company because Lotte Kramer was only a cousin, you know. It was not, so she didn't have any, she didn't have any part in this company. So they were not aware of it. And I didn't feel any hostility, on the contrary. I think Lotte Kramer was quite happy to be able to tell her story. She would also complain that her grandchildren were not interested in her past. So it was positive. Well, most of the time, you know, I do also documentary films, and most of the time, witnesses, especially older people, are always very happy to speak about their past. And when I do presentation of the book, I have, well, not survivor of the Holocaust, but descendants of survivors, and well, they're glad that there is this book, you know, even if it's nothing special to write a book like this, but maybe just to have, you know, always this recognition. I think it's very important to always recognize the suffering, you know. I mean, for many Jews in Europe nowadays, it's difficult because anti-Semitism is raging in many countries, and many don't know anymore how they should react. You know, many go to Israel, in France especially. They go to live in Israel. And some don't want to hear anything anymore about the Holocaust, especially the new generations, because they feel like it's maybe you know the reason why there's so much attention towards Jews, and so this also triggers some kind of anti-Semitism.
So I have a question about like France today and attitudes toward Germans, because your story about your French, I forgot what the relationship was, but basically saying I'd rather you marry a French beggar.
Mm-hmm.
My grandmother, and she was born in 41, and she tells me that her and her brother were bullied like really heavily at school because her last name was Nicolini, which is a very like Italian last name. So that kind of like reminded me of that. And I was wondering, in today, like France, the younger generations, do you think that that animosity against Germans has kind of trickled down in some sense, or do you think it's completely gone?
And then I think maybe some politicians would still instrumentalize this past to criticize, you know, Germany's domination in Europe, you know, economically, for example. You would find that. But then, no, the new generation, I would say they rather look at Germany as a country which has a quite solid democracy, and that maybe in France we would like to have a democracy which is a bit similar to the one in Germany, more transparency. Chancellor Angela Merkel, helped a lot to improve the image of Germany in France. She was a very popular politician outside of Germany, maybe more outside than inside. And she spread this image of a very transparent, open, honest Germany. So this is today the main image of Germany in France.
Laura,
There's a question from American University Professor Jackowitz. Do you have any idea of what could be done to get grandchildren interested in the history? And is there a difference between interest of European grandchildren versus US grandchildren?
It's for me the question, or well, I'm not very familiar about grandchildren in the US. So maybe you can answer that part. For Europe, it's a problem the Europeans have today, now that the last witnesses are dying. You know, how do you transmit this memory. And there are polls which show that many young people don't even know about the Shoah. I don't have the figures in my head, maybe you have them, but they are quite frightening. And even in Germany, less in Germany than in other countries, but still. And so there is, I think maybe one way is first to try to get to change the perspective, so not to spread the culture of guilt anymore, because this is too much of a burden for the new generations, but to transmit this history in more a culture of responsibility, of historical responsibility, and also to show to the new generation that history is not a burden, but it's a wealth, it's a kind of experience that they can, profit from, to shape the present and the future, to understand where they come from, not to be the victims of manipulation strategies, of demagogy, to be more clever. And second, I think it's very important to establish an emotional tie also, and this emotional tie with a history which is distant. I think one way to do it is with family history. So this professor, maybe can talk about his history to his grandchildren. It's in the family themselves. There should be more communication about the family's past, the history, because I think then history becomes, of course, private. Becomes part of the family and not anonymous anymore. And maybe then young people will ask themselves what made sense what does it mean if my grandfather suffered or made mistakes if I don't learn anything from it?
Yes, I think, and I don't know if there's a difference between American or European grandchildren, but I think the moment becomes personal and also local. I remember in the 1980s there were also these history competitions, and it was about, my town or my village, or if you're in New York City, maybe a little different, but what happened here. And I think once it's not so abstract, as you say, your family or in your town, then it's easier to transmit. And I don't know if there's a major difference between American or European young generation in that respect. I guess we have time for one last question. Let's see. One? Yes.
So you talked about how younger generations are becoming disinterested or maybe even ignorant towards topics with the Holocaust. Was there any backlash towards you writing this book of people who maybe didn't think it was prevalent or necessary, or?
Yes, but not especially from younger generation. In Germany there is a far-right party right now called AfD, which entered parliament in 2017 for the first time since World War II. And their slogan is, one of their slogans is that, they want to get rid of memory work, more or less. And this influenced the people, part of the people in Germany. Why should how long do we have to pay for this past, for these crimes we didn't even commit? So I regularly, during presentations, I have questions like this, and I answer always the same, which is actually the reason why these parties are, mobilizing themselves against memory work is because it serves their political aim, because memory work is the basis of democracy in Germany. So if you attack memory work, you attack democracy, and you make people less vigilant, less clever about strategies which these parties are actually using.
maybe at the very end, can you tell us what's your new project? So you're a documentary filmmaker as well, you're a journalist, I don't know if you have a new book in, but what is your new
Yes.
project?
It's a book about Europe,
Mhm.
and it's called What We Share and What Divides Us.
Very appropriate. Thank you very much,
Thank
and
you.
thanks for your questions.